We're beginning the Kaligastro and the Egyptian Rite of Freemasonry section of The Phoenix, an illustrative review of occultism and philosophy by Manly P. Hall. Here is a picture of Count Kaligistro, apparently. Start out with the pictures. Moving on to the dialogue. Whenever historical problems become a little difficult or obscure, historians have an irresistible impulse to take refuge under the respectability of tradition. An outstanding example of this procedure is the case of Count Kaligistro. He was one of those unfortunate men whose reputation rested in the hands of his enemies, and these pressed their advantage with an unholy zeal. The only prominent champion of the maligned count is W.H.R. Tobridge, in his thoughtful work Kaligastro, the splendor and misery of a master of magic. It is regrettable that even the Encyclopedia Britannica 1946 merely repeats the old gossip and makes no effort whatsoever to examine the serious aspects of this problem. The terrible sequence of circumstantial evidence which has been used to discredit the flamboyant Count is built upon the assumption that he was born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1743, that his real name was Giuseppe Balsamo, and that he fled from Sicily to escape punishment for serious crimes committed in the region of his birth. Therefore he was a fugitive from the law, an ignorant peasant who had traveled extensively in remote areas, gathering fables and legends, upon which he built his career of imposture. This story was given extensive publicity in connection with his trial before the Inquisitional Court for the crime of heresy in general, and the establishment of a Masonic lodge in Rome in particular. There is no actual proof that Kaligastro or Balsamo were the same person, and the Count's story of his early life, as set forth in his confessions, presents an entirely different and completely irreconcilable report of his birth and early life. The thoughtful reader may be inclined to investigate further if circumstances be used against a man to destroy his reputation and culminate his character. It seems only reasonable that mitigating circumstances should be admissible when the occasion arises. During his long and bizarre career as Kaligastro, there is no actual proof that he committed any wrong or exploited to his own advantage the large sphere of influence which he enjoyed. His intimate friends and associates were persons of brilliance and distinction. Among these was accepted not only as an equal, but as a superior. There is no hint that he disillusioned them or disappointed them in any way, or that he was unable to maintain his claims and pretensions when the need arose. Let us assume for a moment that a certain Giuseppe Balsamo was a criminal, and that the police or other law enforcement agencies of both London and Paris were searching diligently to apprehend this Sicilian desperado. It is not remarkable that a man seeking to evade punishment for his crime would permit himself to become the best publicized person in Europe. Ladies carried his portrait on their fans, gentlemen on their snuff boxes, statues of him sold by the thousands, and he sat for a number of portraits. A man traveling in those days, especially if he was veiled in mystery, was under constant surveillance. His every move was watched, and spies reported their findings to the various government agencies involved. Giuseppe Balsamo might have lost himself in some small community, but scarcely in the greatest metropolitan center of Europe. Yet at no time during his spectacular career was Count Kaligistro recognized as Balsamo by any person, nor was there any direct effort made even to associate him with the Sicilian criminal. Considering the temple of his adversaries, the situation is incredible. Also, this Balsamo left Sicily a comparatively obscure person without education or any or any known aptitudes on the level of higher intellectualism. Assuming that he was born in 1743 and that he left Sicily near his 20th year, we come to the date approximately 1763. To assume the attainments and proportions of Kaligastro, he must have made incredible progress in arts and sciences between 1763 and 1771. When Kaligastro became the idol of Paris, where did he study? Who were his teachers? Did he attend any reputable school or university? Is it assumed that he lived the life of a wandering mountebank, a career of perpetual deceit and subterfuge? This is all assumed because there is not a jot or tittle of evidence. All we know is that Kaligastro was deeply and broadly learned, well able to defend himself in conversation and discussions with leading savants and scholars. Also, his personality was such that while he was considered eccentric, there seemed to be no more question as to his good blood and gentle breeding. The real crux of the matter was the Count's attitude toward the traditional institutions of his time. He believed in magic. He claimed and demonstrated supernatural powers. He conjured spirits, predicted future events, and claimed to have medicines, talismanic and alchemical, by which he performed extraordinary cures without remuneration. His free clinics brought upon him the undying enmity of the physicians. His disconcerting remarks irritated the learned, and his dire pronouncements about the future of France disturbed the aristocracy. Only the private citizen, and especially the underprivileged groups, bestowed upon him their honest affections. He was called the friend of the poor, and he proved this friendship upon numerous occasions. In the closing quarter of the 18th century, magic was still fashionable, but the Count's claims to transcendental accomplishments have not endeared him to the historians of the 19th and 20th centuries. These gentlemen of peculiarly limited insight take it for granted and expect their readers to do likewise, that any man claiming to possess secret knowledge about the lost arts and sciences of ancient thaumaturgy? I've heard of theurgy, but not thaumaturgy. Must obviously and inevitably be a fraud and a deceiver, unless, of course, you wish to be charitable and merely assume that he is insane. Recent books about the Count, therefore, have scarcely been sympathetic or unbiased. Only a deeper appreciation for the essentials of true learning can bring a more charitable estimation. Thus we have a great deal of smoke, but actually very little fire. It can certainly be said that Kaligastro did very little to protect himself or guard his reputation. He was headstrong, stubborn, and uncompromising. He dressed unconventionally, bore himself imperiously, and catered to the whims of no one. It almost seems that he planned his own destruction, at least moved toward it without any consideration for consequences. His conduct endeared him to some, but fanned the fury of his enemies. Their reticence in openly attacking him was due in part to the strong patronage he enjoyed and to his unquestioned popularity with the people of France. From the confessions of Kaligastro, we gain his own account of his original and rise. While the story is certainly unusual, it is not necessarily an impossible record. In fairness, it may also be said that the Count's autobiography has not been disproved. Historians have been content merely to dismiss it with an empiric gesture. It seems appropriate to summarize the interesting tale. The Count tells us that he cannot speak positively as to the place of his nativity or about the parents who gave him birth. He says that he spent the years of his early childhood in the city of Medina in Arabia, where he was brought up under the name of Akarat, and continued to use that name during his travels through Africa and Asia. He lived in the palace of the chief of the Muslim region, who at that time resided in Medina. During his childhood, 4 persons attended him, 3 servants who took care of his physical wants, and a governor or tutor, a man of advanced years named Alfotas. From this governor or teacher, the count learned that he had been left an orphan when only 3 months of age, that his parents were Christian and of noble birth. Alfotas, however, refused absolutely to reveal the names of the parents or the birthplace of their child, but by imitation Kaligastro was induced to suspect that he was born at Malta. The count held Alfotas in the deepest and tenderest esteem, for this man bestowed upon him all the care and attention of a father, and instructed him in many branches of learning. At that time the count claimed that his principal interests were in subjects of botany and physics. By Alfotas also the lad was taught to worship God, to love and assist his neighbors, and respect the religion and laws of all nations. They both dressed like Moslems and conformed outwardly to the faith of Islam, but inwardly they were true to the Christian teachings. Alfotas also taught the count many Eastern languages, and described to him the religious mysteries of Egypt, the ancient builders and pyramids, and those vast subterranean caves which the ancient Egyptians had fashioned as repositories for their knowledge. When the count resided his 12th year, the desire to travel so increased that arrangements were made that he and Alfotas should visit strange and wonderful places. In due time they joined a caravan and arrived at Mecca, where they were lavishly entertained by the sovereign. They remained at Mecca for 3 years under the protection and regard of the prince of that city. One day, when the count was alone, the prince entered his apartment, and embracing him with the tenderness of a parent, exclaimed, "Farewell, thou nature's unfortunate child." After leaving Mecca, the count and Alfotas visited Egypt, where he not only viewed and examined the great pyramids, but became acquainted with the teachers of various sects, and studied with them. Accompanied by Alfotas, he arrived in 1766 at the island of Rhodes, and there took a French ship bound for Malta. After being released from quarantine, which was compulsory at Malta, the count and his companions were received by the Grand Master Pinto, who gave them apartments in his palace. It was here that Kaligastro assumed for the first time European dress, and took the name by which he was known in Europe. At this time also, Alfotas changed his costume to a religious habit ornamented with the insignia of the Order of the Knights of Malta. Caligistro tells us that he had reason to believe that Pinto, the Grand Master, was acquainted with his real origin. He often spoke of the Sharif of Medina, and mentioned the city of Turbizond, but would never enlarge upon the details of the subject. The Grand Master Pinto treated the count with utmost distinction, and invited him to become one of the Knights of Malta, but Kaligistro preferred to continue his life to travel and advance himself in the science of medicine. It was while at Malta that the venerable Alfotas departed from this world. Shortly before his death, he addressed these words to his student: "My son, keep forever before your eyes the fear of God and the love of your fellow creatures. You will soon be convinced by experience of the truth of what you have been taught by me." After the death of Alfotas, the count had no further to desire. had no further desire to remain at Malta, so he bade leave to quit the island and proceeded on his way to Europe. The Cavalier d'Aquino decided to accompany the Count and to provide the necessary means and contacts to make the journey pleasant. They paused briefly at Sicily and arrived in due course at Naples, which was the birthplace of the Cavalier d'Aquino. Here they separated, and the Count proceeded to Rome, provided with a letter of credit on the banking house of the Sieur Bellon. When he arrived at the capital of the Christian world, he decided to preserve a strict incognito. One morning, however, the secretary of Cardinal Ursini called upon him, requesting that the Count wait on his eminence. The cardinal received Kaligastro with most flattering civility, frequently entertained him at his table, and introduced him to prominent members of the church and state, among them Cardinal York and another cardinal who later became Pope Clement XIV. He was also presented to the then reigning pope. The Count tells us that this was in the year 1770, and that he was 22 years of age at that time. Fortune, and as he expressed it, produced him the acquaintance of a young lady of quality, Serafina Feliciana. He married her, and many years later, when writing his confession, stated that 16 years of marriage had only served to strengthen their mutual devotion. His only regret was that his unfortunate wife, in spite of her virtue and innocence, suffered cruelly from the unmerited persecution that descended upon them both. The Count then explains that he has neither the time nor inclination to write a voluminous work about himself. He therefore desires to mention only certain persons whom he has closely known, and invites his accusers to communicate with these persons to find out if he has ever been guilty of any action disgraceful to a man of honor. Let these prominent citizens declare if the Count at any time has asked a favor or courted the protection of the princes. Let them also say whether the Count has ever been guilty of a worse offense than charity to the poor and the treatment of the sick without remuneration. His list includes in Spain the Duke d'Alba and several other noble persons in Portugal. He was introduced at court by Comte San Vincenti. Comte San Vincenti. He adds that his banker at Lisbon was Anselmo La Cruz. In Holland, his patron was the Duke of Brunswick. In Russia, Prince Potemkin, and in Poland, the Princess of Nassau. He adds that in different countries, he traveled under assumed names, including Comte Sarat, Comte Phoenix, and Marquis Diana, but the name by which he is most generally known throughout Europe is that of Comte de Kaligastro. He then asks if, since his arrival in France, he has actually offended anyone. If so, let the injured speak and rise up in judgment against him. He says that he has always done good because it was his duty, yet his reward for his services to the French nation has been bitterness and woe. Then follows a series of letters from prominent persons in various countries testifying to the Count's good name and character. These letters are all in the same vein, and one signed by Marquis de Mirominal, Keeper of the Seal, dated Versailles, March 15, 1783, is indicative. The Comte de Kaligastro has zealously employed his time since he has settled in Strasbourg in relieving the poor and necessitous relieving the poor and the necessitous, and, to my knowledge, that foreigner has in several instances acted with that humanity which makes him worthy of a particular protection. I beg you will, as far as concerns you and the magistrates whose chief you are, I beg you will, as far as concerns you and the magistrates whose chief you are, procure him all that support and tranquillity with every stranger ought to enjoy within his majesty's dominion, especially when he makes himself useful to the nation. There is a letter in a similar vein by Comte de Vergennes, Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs, for Foreign Affairs. Kaligastro's association with Freemasonry and his efforts to introduce the Egyptian rite of Freemasonry in Paris also opened several interesting fields of speculation. According to de Morande, editor of Le Courrier de l'Europe, Count Caligastro, stating himself to be a colonel in the 3rd Regiment of Brandenburg, was initiated into Freemasonry in London, April 12, 1777. His lodge was the Esperance Lodge, affiliated with the Order of Strict Observance. When de Morande made the sarcastic remark that Caligastro's lodge was composed for the most part of insignificant persons, humble tradesmen and craftsmen of Soho, Caligastro replied briskly and to the point. He said that he was proud to be acknowledged as a brother of good and honorable men, and that it had not occurred to him to check their financial or social standing. This controversy was not carried on any further, and it was considered good taste to allow the Count's Masonic affiliations to rest in peace. It should be remembered that at this time, the barriers separating regular Masonry from the clandestine rites had not been firmly established. Like Saint Germain, Kaligistro was accused of being an agent of the Knights Templar of Jerusalem. He was also suspected of a connection with the Bavarian Illuminati. Neither of these associations impressed the Inquisitional court favorably. In fact, they probably led to an arbitrary conviction on the grounds of association alone. The feud between the Knights Templars and Rome was waged with extraordinary bitterness, and it was suspected in many quarters that the Order of the Temple still existed and was resolved to revenge itself and avenge its martyrs. In our library is a contemporary manuscript of the Lodge of Adoption of High Egyptian Masonry, founded by the Grand Mufti Kaligastro. The title page of this manuscript is reproduced herewith, and it is addressed to the dear brother Robelin, member of the Royal Lodge of St. John of Scotland, from the friend of nature and humanity. The rise of the Egyptian rite corresponds closely with a renaissance of classical learning in France. It was a time in which secret societies devoted to mystical and alchemical speculations were extremely popular. The Egyptian rite gathered to itself an extraordinary group of glittering personalities, but unfortunately the nobles and courtiers of the day were dilettantes with slight equipment for serious study or reflection. I gotta read that over. The Egyptian rite gathered to itself an extraordinary group of glittering personalities, but unfortunately the nobles and courtiers of the day were dilettantes with slight equipment for serious study or reflection. Caligistro might have done better had he not been involved in the decadence of a declining era against which even his strength was insufficient. Actually, the Egyptian rite gives very little information which is traceable to a knowledge of antiquities. It is a charming and delightful symbolical pageantry, and may have been accompanied by more serious lectures or interpretations which apparently have not been preserved. The account of the initiation of Kaligastro and his wife at the chateau of Ermenonville, though dramatic, is almost certainly exaggerated. It is certain that Kaligastro was initiated by Saint Germain, but the derogatory account of de Luquet is discredited from the simple fact that he was not present at the occasion of the so-called initiation, and in fact makes no claim to such a privilege. The further circumstance that the initiation was completely secret required de Luquet to write from gossip or such dubious reports as may have been in circulation. De Luquet writes of an incredible spectacle in which the court and Countess Kaligastro were brought, in the darkness of night, into a ruined chapel lighted with hundreds of candles, in the midst of which Saint Germain was enthroned, wearing a breastplate of jewels and receiving homage as the God of the faithful. On the more serious side, Kaligastro, in connection with the foundation of his order of Egyptian Masonry, was examined by a committee selected by the Masonic lodges in Paris. This Grand Orient selected the most learned Orientalists in France, M. Court de Gebelin, to interrogate Kaligastro on Egyptian philosophy and related matters. It is recorded that M. Court de Gebelin realized almost instantly that he had met his master, and so remarkable were the Count's replies and remarks on this occasion that the whole assemblage was speechless with amazement. From the fragments that floated on the surface, we may gather that important changes were taking place in the secret school operating behind Freemasonry. The world was changing. A critical period was at hand. There are no accidents in nature, and there is a reason for the men who stand behind the men who change the course of history. The deeper projects of Saint Germain and Kaligastro will never be captured between the covers of a printed book. In the last 200 years, a complete transformation has taken place in the affairs of men and the social state of nations. The concept of democracy has emerged, and one by one, to borrow the motto of Kaligastro, the lilies have been trodden underfoot. Probably he meant the lilies of France, but a larger implication, all despotism is circumscribed by the inference. The trial of Kaligastro has perhaps justly been called the prologue to the French Revolution. For the ill-starred Count, all roads led to Rome. His trial there was a farce, even when the records themselves are examined. He was a victim of fear and bitterness, and there is no doubt that he could have saved himself had he chosen a course of greater discretion. Oh, my goodness. I guess I don't read that word too much. He was a victim of fear and bitterness, and there is no doubt that he could have saved himself had he chosen a course of greater discretion. He was found guilty of Masonic activity in the Eternal City and condemned to death. For some reason not disclosed, the Pope commuted his sentence for perpetual imprisonment. His wife was forced to retire into a convent for the rest of her days. The death of Kaligastro is believed to have occurred in 1795 after several years of imprisonment in an inquisitional dungeon in the castle prison of San Leo. Even in this, however, there is no certainty, and the so-called records of his death are insufficient as the records of his life. There are rumors that the secret society with which he was associated contrived his escape, and that he took refuge later in India. It is probable that his wife joined him there. In conclusion, we might quote from Tobridge, whose kindliness of spirit divides him from most other biographers of Kaligastro. The mistrust that misery and magic always inspires made Kaligastro, with his fantastic personality, an easy target for calumny. After having been riddled with abuse till he was unrecognizable, Prejudice, the foster child of calumny, proceeded to lynch him, so to speak. For over 100 years his character has dangled on the gibbet of infamy, upon which the Sibyri of tradition have inscribed a curse on anyone who shall attempt to cut him down. His fate has been his fame. He is remembered in history, not so much for anything he did as for what was done to him. And that's it for today.